Good evening. Welcome to yet another edition of the Oz Katerji Show. Thanks to everyone joining me live on Twitch. If you're following along on Twitter, the only way to interact with me tonight will be in Twitch, so you'll have to sign up to Twitch, make an account. Please do follow if you do that. You can feel free to ask any questions you want. Tonight's going to be a show where we're going to learn quite a lot, because I'm going to be learning quite a lot because I don't know much about this topic. So I'm certainly looking forward to it. We're going to be diving into the world of Trump and tariffs. So yeah, without further ado, my guest is a trade expert, a former diplomat and trade negotiator, Dmitry Grozoubinski. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Dmitry. Did I get your name right? Oh, you are currently muted for some reason. I'm not sure why. I tell you what, try jumping out and jumping back in, Dmitry. That sometimes. Yeah. Sorry about that. He was working before. Here he is. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Perfect.
There we go. Dmitry, welcome to the show. So at the start of the show, I normally ask my guests to tell the audience a little bit about themselves, tell us your background. You know, you really are someone who knows like virtually everything there is to know about trade. You're like, I'm giving like Trump like sounding sound bites for the for the clips. But yeah, you are a trade expert. So tell us a bit about your background, and yeah, we can then dive into I think there's going to be a lot of questions tonight about what the hell's going on with all of this stuff. So who are you? What's your background?
I think we're all wondering who we are. Oz. My name is Dmitry. I was born in Ukraine, but left when I was 6, moved to Australia, and at some point, in between being a massive nerd, decided I was going to focus my nerddom on foreign affairs and trade policy. I ended up doing a master's in diplomacy and trade in Australia and joining the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where I ended up doing a bunch of stuff, doing the MH17 response in Ukraine, and being posted for 3 years to Australia's permanent mission to the World Trade Organization. So served my time there doing tradey things, and then shortly thereafter decided to stay in Europe and ended up getting a series of gigs basically teaching governments how to do trade negotiations. At the time, I was newly unemployed. Every man, woman, and child in the UK needed to be trained in how trade works because they just decided to Brexit. So I basically ended up training half the civil service and a lot of private companies, and ended up running a think tank for the Swiss here in Geneva called the Geneva Trade Platform, flying around the world, teaching governments from sort of India, Argentina, UK, Netherlands at one point. And yeah, basically what I specialize in doing is trying to explain trade policy in a way that kind of sort of makes sense.
Well, I hope so, because you know a lot of this stuff flies over my head. You know, I'm very much aware of like international relations and foreign policy stuff, but the economic stuff is really not my specialty. So, but I probably understand more than someone who knows nothing about the subject, I guess, because it touches upon so much of what we deal with, specifically with regards to sanctions. Maybe we can have a little bit of a chat about sanctions slightly later on. But to start with, look, give us a background into what's going on at the moment. Basically, since Trump came into power, it should be said that there was a sort of economic turmoil during the Biden administration, global turmoil due to the war in Ukraine, COVID recovery, etc., etc. But in America, at least, the economy seemed to be doing pretty well, even though inflation was high. So, can you maybe like take us just before Trump came in and talk to us about what the global economic situation was like shortly before Trump came into office, and what it's like now following these sort of, even if some of these tariffs haven't kicked in, the threat of them has, obviously impacted the markets. So if you could explain some of that to me, especially, I'm sure I'd be very grateful, and the audience as well. Listen, if you guys have got any questions tonight as well, please put them in the chat. I would love to ask Dmitry any questions you have. We've got him here, so we might as well pick his brains as best we can. So Dmitry, Trump tariffs, let's go.
Sure. At the risk of making every one of your viewers unplug their computer and hurl it across the room, in order to understand what's happening with Trump, you have to go really briefly back, way further back, and to sort of understand why what he's doing is disruptive and what was the status quo before. So the 30-second version of trade policy history is that after World War II, the world needed a huge amount of capital and investment to rebuild Europe. But investors were looking at a Europe that firstly was kind of burning, and secondly had just gone through the Great Depression, during which governments had reacted to high unemployment and low popularity by slapping tariffs on one another. They had reacted to that by they'd put tariffs on one another and made trade really unpredictable. So investors, capital were going, well, hold on. You want us to make decades-long investments in rebuilding Europe. You want us to build a factory in Europe to build a car, but that factory won't pay for itself for 20 years, and it won't even start to really generate revenue for 6 years. What confidence do we have that 5 years from now, after we've made this investment, you governments aren't all going to start getting nervous or populist or just kind of mean and start putting in place all of these barriers that mean my car company can't get what it needs, and my car company can't sell its cars abroad. So in order to give investors and markets that certainty to make those kind of investments, governments started making a whole bunch of binding promises to each other. They basically said, we are going to try to make trade predictable. We're going to say, we're going to put limits on how much we can, I presume I can swear on your show? Yeah, I thought so. How much basically we can just fuck with trade on a whim. We're going to make some promises to each other that we're going to limit the fuckery in the interest of everyone being cool. And that'll be annoying for us in some cases, because sometimes you do want to fuck with trade. You've got a factory you don't want to go under, and oh, maybe I want to fuck with trade a bit to keep it alive. But the broader benefit of keeping the world stable outweighs that. And that kind of, with a lot more history behind it and a lot more things going on, that kind of held for 60-ish years. With some ups and downs, some rollbacks, whatever, where the preference was stability and predictability, which allows investments to go overseas, supply chains to be efficient, is preferable to what you can do with agile trade policy, slapping tariffs left and right. In the last, I would say, 12 years, so even before Trump's first term, that was beginning to fracture at the edges. You had the European Union going yeah, predictability is great, but we have a bunch of environmental concerns. And we're worried that if we're the only ones who are pursuing environmental concerns and we can't do trade stuff at the border, we're just going to end up screwing ourselves and not saving the planet. You had other countries being well, we'd rather to see to help our industries grow in ways that the rules say we maybe can't. And you had the US saying, hey, we're preparing for a epoch-defining geostrategic, geoeconomic conflict with China. And firstly, we're not sure that the rules even constrain China. But even if they did, we need all of our economic firepower. We can't be having our hands tied behind our back. And so that was already a trend that was happening. Trump has turned that up to 11, broken off the dial, and is beating the world economy slowly to death with it. What he is basically doing is thrown out all of those promises. He said none of those promises matter. From his perspective, those promises are only useful to the extent that they provide predictability. But he's the US can provide predictability in that anyone who dares tariff us we can tariff them back so hard, they'll back off.
I'm going to tariff you so hard.
Tariff you so hard all night and so on. Pick your own dirty metaphors. So basically what Trump is doing is he's gone, okay, forget all of those promises. What I would like to do is use tariff policy as an active tool of economic and foreign policy. So what do I want to do? I want to raise revenue. So tariffs are a tax, effectively. If you introduce tariffs, you're going to raise money for the US Treasury, money that you can use to do things. Cool beans. Secondly, he's like, well, if I introduce tariffs on everybody, they're going to want to negotiate with me, because the US has 400 million of the world's spendiest consumers. The average American household spends like 35% more than the average German household. And everybody else spends way less than that. So you want to be able to sell to America.
Having been to America recently, I will say that like you can't even walk down the street without it costing you at least $100. Like everything costs $100 in America now, and it's crazy, because that is a lot of money anywhere else in the world, but in America, $100 is really not a lot of money anymore. So.
But like the key thing is, like, I live in Switzerland, which is just like stupid expensive. Like it's just dumb how much stuff costs here. But the key difference with the US, apart from obviously the size of the population, is that the Swiss do not spend money if they can't help it. The Swiss will save at a much greater rate than Americans will. Everybody does. Europeans save a considerable amount more of their paycheck than Americans do by choice. And like the Chinese and people in Southeast Asia save like way more. So Americans are the only ones who like spend while being wealthy. And that means that being able to sell to the US matters more than being able to sell to just about anybody else. Make sense? So that way, if the Trump administration turns around to you as a country and says, we're going to make it more expensive for you to sell us stuff, or we're going to make it more expensive for our people to buy your stuff, that's pretty scary because it locks you out of the US market. And especially if your competitors might get a sweet deal. If you're Japan, like a 30% car tariff into the US is bad, but a 30% car tariff, if Korea doesn't have to pay it, is like horrible. Because then Kia just like outmuscles Toyota or whatever. So he's like, people will negotiate with me. And I'm the art of the deal guy. And in any bilateral negotiation, if it's just the US and another party around the table, he's like, we're the stronger ones, we'll be able to get more. Then he also wants to move factories back to the US. So he's like, if we make it more expensive to get stuff from abroad, that will create incentives to build factories in America. And he wants to encourage American firms to stop buying stuff from China and American consumers to stop buying stuff from China, to sort of hamstring the Chinese economy, decrease the dependence on China, and so on. So there's like the four rationales. And what he's basically started doing is slinging around the tariff code like a mafioso boss, because a whole series of historic acts, some of which date back to the 70s, some of which date back to like the 1800s, give the US president a bizarre amount of authority over the US tariff code that he basically doesn't have anywhere else. By declaring an international economic emergency, the Trump administration has been able to basically do whatever they like with tariffs at the stroke of a pen. When if he wanted to raise taxes on like, I don't know, purple hair dye and just like being gay, he'd have to pass an act of Congress. So he can't do that because Congress is paralyzed and useless and you need to break the filibuster in the Senate. But here he can just wheel and deal. Raise tariffs, lower tariffs with the stroke of a pen. And he loves that. So that's kind of what, I guess, like the background to what's going on and what they're trying to achieve. I'll stop rambling now.
Absolutely not rambling at all. It's fascinating. The question is, I suppose, Could you break down tariffs to an even more basic level? You've explained what Trump's power with them, but a lot of people find tariffs confusing in general. Can you give us the idiot's guide to specifically, because again, I don't think Trump understands them, and I don't think he understands where the money is coming from. It's effectively a tax on the US consumer, right? Because now everything is more expensive to buy, and it's not just the consumer, it's the producer that's buying things from abroad. It multiplies throughout the production chain, right? So give us the basics of what this Trump tariff policy effectively does.
Sure. So we can start with like what tariffs are and how they work, and then sort of build out from there on what Trump's doing. So tariffs at their simplest level are a tax on bringing goods into the country. If you are a business that is trading across borders, so you're bringing goods into the country, when you cross the US border, or indeed any border, you have to submit something that's called an import declaration, which is basically your way of telling the government, here is what's in the box, right? Now, governments have, for like thousands of years at various points, introduced taxes on doing this. So what the government says to you is, okay, on this import declaration, you need to tell me what's in the box so that I can, what tariff code. The government divides every product in the universe into codes and basically says, okay, we're going to charge this percentage of the value on this code and this one on a different one. So you got to tell us what code your stuff is and how much it costs at the time it crosses the border. So you're bringing in a lorry full of iPhones, you're Apple, you're moving iPhones from your factory in India to the United States. And hypothetically, let's say, so you bring in, you've got 1,000 iPhones. On your import declaration, you say, I am carrying 1,000 iPhones. Those correspond to tariff code, like 5, 6, it's an 8 to 12 digit number. And that carries with it a tariff rate of 10%. At the time these phones are crossing the border, they're worth probably like $300 because a lot of the markup will happen after that. So at the time they're crossing the border, we estimate the value of these phones is $300. 10% of $300 is $30. We have to pay you, the government, $30 per phone, right? So if you think about it from the point of view of a business, you are firstly getting hit by just this tariff. So anytime you want to move something into the United States, you're paying a percentage of its value. But secondly, and this is where, this is the counterintuitive part, you have to do the work of figuring out what code each of your products, and if you are something like Amazon or if you are stocking a supermarket, your container could have 300 different products, where they all come from. And then it gets even more complicated because the US government says, hey, we're applying different tariffs on different countries. So we're charging China like a 30% tariff, but we're only charging the UK a 10% tariff. You have to prove to us that your UK goods aren't secretly Chinese. So you also have to demonstrate to us a long, long paper trail of here are all of the components in my iPhone. And here is the calculation of how much each of them cost, in terms of value added. And good luck pricing an individual component of an iPhone, by the way. But here's how much they contributed to the total value of the iPhone. And if that is below 60%, then I can't claim it's really British. So basically, companies are getting hit with a massive, massive amount of uncertainty and paperwork, in addition to just what the tariffs are. You're muted, us.
Before we go into more about how Trump is using them, because Trump obviously didn't invent tariffs. As you said, that tariffs have a long-standing history. But what was the world of tariffs like when we're talking about trade policy between the US and the EU, the US and the Far East, what was the cut? Because the US did have tariffs on some goods, right? So what was the tariff situation like before Trump came into office? And what has he done differently now? And again, you might have to update us on what has actually come into effect, what's being threatened to come into effect, because a lot of what Trump's defenders will say is these are a negotiating tactic so that the US can get a better deal. And because Trump is obsessed with trade deficits as well. So like that's something else to explain what a trade deficit is and why Trump thinks it's a bad thing. I think is also part of the answer as to what's going on.
You may have to throw me the second part of that question again once I'm done rambling, because I tend to forget where I am halfway through a round.
We'll do trade deficit afterwards.
We'll do trade deficit afterwards. Okay, so a really brief history of tariff policy. It started out back in like a million years ago. The stuff that was being traded was mostly like luxury goods. And so governments started raising tariffs on we're talking like before the Middle Ages here, like Middle Ages times. They would put tariffs in order to raise revenue. It was a really easy way to collect taxes because stuff only tends to cross your borders in like 4 places in your country.
So we're talking silk, rum, tobacco,
exactly.
that kind of thing. Yeah.
So if you imagine most forms of taxation, something like income tax or VAT, it actually requires a huge amount of government like machinery and competence to be able to do it. You have to quite literally know how much money every business in the country is making. Like to do payroll taxes, you need to know how much every person is making. If you're in like the 1200s, you don't have that infrastructure, but you can pretty easily work out how much silk is crossing a border. Does that make sense? Then basically more recently, governments have figured out that as more and more like just stuff people wear and eat started moving around, tariffs are a pretty inefficient tax. It's really regressive because it tends to hit poor people. It encourages a lack of innovation. It just encourages whining to the government to raise tariffs if you're an industry. It's not a particularly efficient form of taxation. And so most governments moved away from it. So, for example, like 2 years ago, the average tariffs between the US and EU, between like Australia and other places, Japan, the average tariff tended to be somewhere around 2 to 3%. So governments would eliminate tariffs on like half of goods or more. Then they'd keep quite low tariffs in a couple of places. And then on individual products that were sensitive for whatever domestic reason, they'd have really high tariffs. So for example, the US has really, really low tariffs, except on light trucks. If you want to send the equivalent of a Ford F-150 to the US before Trump, you have to pay a 25% tariff under something inexplicably called the chicken tax, because it emerged over a fight over poultry with like Mexico. It's a whole thing. But like Japan has really low tariffs everywhere except on rice, where you pay obscenely high tariffs to send Japan rice. Like that's just because they want to protect Japanese rice farming as a cultural way of life. It's politically significant, yada yada. So what you generally had was like really, really low tariffs and then like individual peaks on individual products. Beef and lamb and sugar into the EU. There were a couple of exceptions around the world. Developing countries tended to have higher tariffs on average. Depends on the country, but like probably the largest big country that still had pretty high tariffs was India. And I think its tariffs were somewhere around the 10% average range. And like the Indian trade policy, like you could do 4 different podcasts on it. It's a unique thing. So that's kind of where the averages were. What Trump has done is, first of all, introduced a blanket 10% tariff on just about everything from everywhere. So the US average tariff went from like 1.9 or something to 10 plus, first of all. Secondly, he then has basically started doing country by country tariffs, where on what he calls Liberation Day, so back in April, he announced a series of tariffs on just about every country in the world based on how much more they were selling to the US than the US was selling to them. Then he froze those tariffs after markets completely melted down. Indeed, no liberation that day. So he froze those, but he continued kind of doing individual bilateral diplomacy. With China, tariffs went up to 145%, and have now come down to 30 to 50, kind of depending on what you're talking about. With other countries, the threats were suspended. Where we stand at the moment is he has done deals with the UK, Japan, Korea, and he sort of Canada and sort of Mexico. So on the North American continent, as long as your goods are eligible for NAFTA or USMCA, they continue to circulate tariff-free. Cars kind of circulate tariff-free, provided the steel and parts in them are American. It's very complicated. With the UK, he has kept the 10%, and he has lowered the car tariff somewhat within a quota. With Japan and the EU, he's done these deals, but everybody's actually waiting for him to actually like change the tariffs at the border, because he like announces stuff, but it's never a finished deal. And then you have to wait for the official instructions to Customs and Border Protection to find out what he thinks he agreed to. And so we're basically in a whole spot of chaos. And then he also randomly hit Brazil with 50% tariffs because he doesn't like that they are prosecuting Bolsonaro. And he has hit Switzerland with 39% tariffs because their trade surplus went up so much in the last 6 months, and they didn't liberate their agriculture tariffs with him in negotiations. That's kind of where we are now.
So, you know, what is Trump doing with this trade deficit issue? How is he understanding things? Try and explain what a trade deficit is to us. In these, I mean, again, the words are self-explanatory, but the kind of minutiae details that actually make up, what a country considers a trade deficit. And also, I guess, try and give us some background about what America exports to the world. You know, what are, Malaysians buying from the United States in large amounts? What I can't think of any American products made in America besides Apple, which is everywhere, but most of the products they have in my daily life, and again, Apple stuff isn't made in America for the most part, but most of the stuff I use in my daily life isn't American. Even the technology that I have comes from Australian mics or a bunch of different places. So it's just what is America exporting to the world that Trump is so furious about that the world isn't buying?
Sure. So let's start with trade deficits. As you suggested, trade deficits are pretty self-explanatory. In a bilateral sense, they occur when I am exporting less to you than you are exporting to me. Serious people, and Donald Trump is not one of them, consider trade, when we talk about trade, we talk about really two things. There's goods and services. And so the Trump is exclusively focused on the goods deficit, so physical products. This excludes a massive thing, which is called services, of which the US is a global superpower. So like the finance sector, professional services, movies, music, like Windows, IT, all of this kind. Google is an export. So he throws all of that away, and he's focusing exclusively on stuff. So his concern is basically that Americans are buying more manufactured goods and agricultural products from abroad than, in a lot of cases, the partner country is buying American stuff. He has quite a zero-sum view of trade policy, in that he thinks basically, if you're paying me money, I have ripped you off. Like, inherently, there is no such thing as a win-win transaction for him. He's looking at that and he's like, well, if we're buying more of their stuff than they're buying of ours, they must be doing one over on us. We're getting ripped off. In practice, it's not really, it's kind of a silly way of looking at it for a bunch of reasons. First of all, like 11-ish%, 9 to 11% of Americans make things, like they work in factories or in farms, whereas 100% of Americans buy things. So in order to outrace the trade surplus, you have to kind of be producing and selling more than 9 of your fellow citizens are buying from abroad. And that's a really hard thing to do when those citizens are, as we've discussed, quite wealthy and live on credit. Now, in terms of the kind of stuff the US makes, the US makes a bunch of stuff. Let's set services aside, because obviously that's a different thing. But the US is a massive agricultural producer. Massive. Stuff like soybeans. It's really boring, but like you need it. If for nothing else, like you feed it to livestock. If you've got a livestock economy, often they are soy-fed, grain-fed. US is a massive grain producer as well. It's called the wheat belt for a reason. Like massive grain production. Then it still just manufactures a lot. The value of US manufacturing has actually gone up in the last sort of few decades, even as employment has gone down. The US just makes a lot of machine goods, stuff that goes into stuff. So for example, like almost the top exports of the US and EU to each other are in this category called like machined goods, where they're basically just making weird widgets. In an like environment of free trade, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a heap of money building a specialized factory in the US if there's already one in Europe and vice versa. It makes a lot more sense to specialize in like building the next widget and just buy your widget from Ohio. So they make a lot of machine goods. They make a hell of a lot of pharmaceuticals. Drugs, obviously massive drug exporter. Some IT stuff, and as Factabulous in your chat alludes to, massive defense exporter as well. You want to see a trade deficit swing really fast, watch somebody buy 10 F-35s and watch what happens to the trade deficit that year.
So I do have a question to ask. You've explained it really, really well, and it kind of, you know, if you are a sort of isolationist and a nationalist American, you're saying, well, we want manufacturing in America to go up. We don't want to buy goods from abroad that we could manufacture at home. Again, without even factoring into the fact that you have to pay labor more in the US and more Americans don't want to do. It's not just, you know, there aren't the factories or whatever. Americans don't want to work in factories above working in, you know, finance or insurance or whatever. Like, you know, there are more that's just the American economy, and it's the strongest economy in the world. So it seems really bizarre to want to take a sledgehammer to it. But that internal logic of what you're saying makes sense. If you wanted to, you know, force people to buy American, you make everything else more expensive to come in. However, we have one example of a policy in America that already exists to do that. A weird one that I'm picking out here. Maybe you might not know much about it, but Coca-Cola, there's a weird, I don't know, trade regulation or whatever in America that basically mandated that the only type of sugar you could use for it was sugar made in the United States rather than the kind of, I don't know if it's cane sugar that they use everywhere else in the world, which is why Mexican Coke is so popular in America, because it's made, even though Mexican Coke is the same as British Coke, there's no real major difference between the two because they're both made with the same types of sugar. But Donald Trump has reversed that policy. So if your argument is that Trump wants to make people buy American by policy, why has he now reversed? Surely there's no logic to forcing companies to buy American sugar if you've just changed that for one of the largest sugar users in the entire world.
I mean, if you're looking for coherence in the Trump approach to trade policy, you're going to be looking for a long time. He's done a bunch of things that sort of directly contradict that dream. Let's even take it half a step back. Let's say your goal is, as you said, you want to move factories back to the United States, right? And you want to use tariff policy to do it. So let's say you're a supply chain manager. You work at a giant company, and I want to convince you to move some factories back to the US. I tell you, we're going to have a 20% tariff on the stuff you bring in from abroad, so you better move the factory in. You're like, that gives me food for thought. Maybe I'll think about it. But then I go out and give a press conference where I say, by the way, I'm going to be negotiating with people, and if they do a good deal for me, I'm going to get rid of that 20% tariff, which is exactly what he's done. Put my headphone. It's exactly what he's done. So you're like, if you're a supply chain manager, you're going like, well, what? I need to make like a $1 billion 15-year commitment to build something if I want to move a factory to the United States, and you're not able to give me policy certainty for 10 minutes. Investment is completely paralyzed. I'm not going to go into statistics now, but investment in the US has plummeted in the last counting. It's fallen off a cliff, because everybody is terrified of the uncertainty. At the same time, you can sort of look at other areas. What is probably the biggest growth area in like manufacturing that you can imagine? It's green tech. We need to put a goddamn solar panel on everything. We need to build a bazillion batteries. We need to build wind turbines everywhere. We've
lost you, Dmitry. Come back. There you go.
We
lost you on wind turbines. We know Trump hates wind turbines. So, yeah, we need to build wind turbines, batteries, solar panels. Go.
Yeah. We need to build all of those things, and we need to do it yesterday. And not only do we need to build them, we need to install them, and we need to service them, and we need to sell them. It's an entire kind of economy you could have there, right? And but because he just like doesn't like green stuff, he is killing all of and actively kind of working against it. mRNA vaccines.
I was going to say the relationship that he had with Elon Musk, who relied so much on government subsidies for green, it never made sense if you are from a business perspective for Elon Musk to go all in on Trump. But again, this is where we are, and now probably Elon Musk companies are suffering as a result of the fact that the subsidy that the government was providing for green vehicles is now gone, right? As far as I understand.
Well, you say it doesn't make sense for Elon Musk to go in on Trump. I think a more cynical view is it made perfect sense. The only way to preserve something like the EV mandate, the only way to make sure that you don't get like outflanked by Bezos and end up losing the contracts on things like Starlink and the rockets, all of that is like, it makes sense to wrap yourself as closely as you can around the president, help get him elected, be his like weird confidant. And now, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that the two men's like severe personality disorders meant that relationship was always on a ticking time bomb. There was a lot of like, this saloon was not big enough for the two of them. But from a purely like, if you were to take their personalities out of it for a moment, or at least take Musk's personality out of it, if you're like a business business advisor, like, yeah, if you rely as much on government largesse as the Tesla network of companies does, and it's like it's not just limited to like Tesla and the EVs and the rockets, like the Boring Company, his stupid tunnel thing basically needs government after government to throw money and like permissions at him to go do stupid tunnels under their city. Like he needs the government to work with him. So I think it actually, from a business perspective, it made a heap of sense. He just thought he could talk him around, I guess.
What with the EV mandate in particular, he just
he thought he could just be like, well, just like keep that one for me because it's like, look at how I'll invest all this money in the US. I'm such a good dude. Like it'll play well on Rogan, whatever, and we'll build like Cybertrucks that are like big and masculine, and you'll love them. And we'll park them on your lawn, and you can sell them.
I mean, it's so nakedly corrupt. But look, I suppose you've given us a real understanding about all of that. But what is the impact it's having on global economic policy? Not just, what's the global economic situation like? I mean, the EU, Australia, the United Kingdom, places that you and I are familiar with. How's it impacting them? How's it impacting South Korea, Japan, parts of the world as well, in the developing world, the Middle East? How is this impacting, not just the relationships, but how other countries are doing trade? Is there a sense that some countries are seeing the US permanently as an unreliable partner now because of Trump, and that they are walling off their economies to not have to worry about with the Americans? Or is America still so integral to the world economy that people are forced to go along with whatever the US says? The EU is obviously trying to push back at some of this. So again, I know that's a very broad spectrum answer, but where is the world going in response to all of this stuff?
I mean, what the world is basically finding is they don't have a ton of great options. Like there isn't one obvious thing to do here, and there's no painless choices. So what you've seen is, first of all, everybody ended up negotiating with Trump. Like on that, you have to say he was right. Like when he threatened those tariffs, everybody came and negotiated. Now, what the Trump administration very quickly found is that they don't have as much leverage as they thought they did. So Trump's big dream was like, we're going to go see, we're going to like change EU regulations. We're going to get all of these tariffs lowered, and Japan's going to get rid of its rice tariff. We're going to get all this stuff done. In truth, couldn't get any of that. Instead, what the US has mostly managed to do is convince countries not to retaliate. Basically, Trump's like, we're going to hit you with 10 to 20% tariffs, and you're not going to hit us back with tariffs. That has been the outcome of most of the deals, on top of a whole bunch of like vaporware commitments on like investment that just mean nothing. Like they're complete nonsense. In Switzerland's case, so this is what he did with the bigger countries. The EU flirted with the idea of retaliation and even like produced retaliation lists and did limited retaliation on some measures. But at the end of the day, when they got offered a kind of 15% tariff, they took it. Because basically the US is less reliant on trade as a percentage of its GDP than any developed country on earth. So there's this sense of like the US can just take more pain and hurt you more. I don't think that's necessarily true, but that's the perception. And I think there's a lot of like, maybe like this will pass. Maybe this is just something we get, right? Like maybe the next president, whether it's like Vance or I don't know, Buttigieg, President Mamdani, gets rid of these tariffs or significantly draws these down. Let's not do anything drastic right now so as not to provoke Trump into raising the tariffs to 100%, get through these next couple of years, pray US democracy endures, and pray that there is actually a succession to someone more reasonable. A lot of commentators have said, well, why don't countries just get together and collectively push back on Trump? It hasn't happened. And the reason is nobody trusts anybody else to hold the line. If there's 5 of us selling cars to the US and we all agree that we're all going to be in solidarity, and no matter what he does to us, we're all going to hit him with 40% tariffs and we're not going to budge. And then he turns around to one of us and goes, I'm going to hit the rest of them in 40% tariffs. But if you meet me halfway, no tariffs on you. Nobody trusts the other 4 to hold the line. They're like Japan. Korea's like Japan would stab us in the back in a heartbeat. Europe's like, we can't trust the Koreans. Nobody believes that solidarity would withstand the sheer like commercial. Because like there's billions on the other side of the scales is like a vague principle. Countries start to like accelerate their trade deals that they're doing with one another and trying to fix up the way trade works within their own country. So like there are borders inside Canada. It's legitimately like annoying to move goods around within Canada. It is a nightmare to do it within India. And so countries are working on that, but that's like a long-term thing. In the short term, they've negotiated. They've held the line on the things that really matter, and they've accepted these tariffs while basically just gradually losing faith in the United States as a beacon.
Well, you missed out President AOC there as a potential. I think she's probably the more likely one, but here's hoping. Again, that the kind of world foreign policy seems to be just appease the man for the next 3 years. And eventually all of this will pass. Particularly as I've been saying that the Ukrainian tactic should really be tell Trump that they will buy huge amounts of weaponry on credit at double the price. That would be a fantastic way. Say, listen, we'll give you 200%, give us a credit. Trump loves debt. Debt is a language that Trump can understand. And if the Ukrainians are able to get that credit extension and buy American hardware, down the line, any American president beyond Trump is going to cancel that immediately. So 400%. It doesn't matter. They're never going to pay for it. Do you know what I mean? The point is to give Trump a win in a language that he understands, in a way that basically allows Ukraine to get what it wants over the next 3 years, because this timeline is crucial. Anyway, so that's how the world is reacting. What impact is it having in the short to medium term on the global economy? Britain isn't in a great place economically. Germany has had really slow growth. We've had COVID and Ukraine happen that have had significant jolts on the global economy. I'm sure the Iran-Israel thing hasn't helped, and that the Houthis impacting shipping through that route. Again, all of these things are having an impact on the global economy. So how much is Trump really influencing the rocky economic times that are basically all around the world, and also helping populist movements thrive? So Trump taking a sledgehammer to the global economy is only helping Trump's allies sweep up votes in other parts of the world. It's maddening to watch happen. But what's the global economic situation like?
Yeah, so far, what we've basically seen is a significant slowdown in investment, and that starts to filter through to everything else. Investment's what makes new jobs possible in a lot of ways, and everybody's freaking out, canceling plans to expand their factories, canceling plans to put money into places, being a lot more defensive about where they go. So, and this hits the developing world really hard, because if he's going to be making up tariffs every 3 days, developing countries have no ability to push back on it. And so you have no idea where you can even build a factory in like Southeast Asia these days in order to avoid US tariffs. It used to be China, then it was Vietnam. Now who the hell knows? So there's kind of that effect. There are probably the biggest thing, the biggest impact is going to be felt initially in the US. And you're already seeing this in really high producer price index numbers. So basically, like US factories and US businesses are paying a lot more for goods and services. You're seeing inflation tick up. You're seeing growth slow down. The problem for the rest of the world is that the rest of the world is like really dependent on US economic activity to kind of function. So what you're seeing is like bond rates are going up, which increases the cost of borrowing for governments, which means the governments have less ability to intervene to try to like fix problems and like address issues. You know, you mentioned the UK is famously broke because it refuses to raise taxes. So you're seeing kind of that effect start to filter down. But basically, it's like when the US catches a cold, the whole global economy starts spasming and coughing. And the US looks like it is in the on stages of quite a serious cold by like a lot of the indicators that have come out. The growth numbers for the last quarter were the worst the US has ever seen outside of a recession. So except during recessions, these are the worst growth the US has ever posted. Like it's quite bad. So all of this stuff is kind of weighing in on it. A lot of the impacts are sort of individual. So they're not turning up in macro so much because, for example, the US stock market's really strong because of the FANG. Basically because we're in the middle of an AI boom or bubble, depending on who you talk to. But basically because NVIDIA, Anthropic and the others, but like printing, they're printing share price. Their share prices keep rising. The stock market's still really, really high. So that's sort of offsetting a lot of things, but that could potentially be fragile. So yeah, there's some like worrying signs. And the world is mostly getting quite nervous. Yeah.
We have a question here from Noel3234 who says, why should anyone believe the next US president wouldn't try to use the tariffs Trump has brought in to force further concessions after he's gone on the basis that they won't be as pernicious as Trump?
Yeah, so look, it's certainly possible. This could just be the new normal. I don't tend to think so for a couple of reasons. First, it hasn't actually worked. Like Trump is about the most like YOLO president you could have for trying this approach, in that like honey badger genuinely do not give a fuck. And he has failed to really secure too many meaningful concessions. So it hasn't worked. It's not popular. It's polling in like the 40s or even the 30s. So it's not a big winner. And depending on who replaces Trump, one fairly easy win you could do just with executive authority to score yourself a lot of love overseas, but also to immediately give your country a tax cut, is to chop these back on day one. So especially if you were running on like a change from Trump candidacy, one really easy pledge to make is like, listen, on day one, I'm going to get rid of a whole bunch of these tariffs that are raising prices for you at Walmart and making our allies around the world hate us. And then you do an Obama, you head to Berlin, you stand on the Brandenburg Gate, and a million people cheer your name.
Okay, look, so we're at the audience question part of the show. So if you've got any questions for Dmitry, please feel free to fire them over. While we wait to see if there are any questions for you, and thanks for answering so many through the show so far. We've had a lot of audience participation tonight, and you've been really good at. I haven't even needed to ask them because you've started answering them on your own. So at least good that the Streamlabs thing is functioning as intended, even if it does drop out occasionally. So look, I guess my question is, we've talked a lot about the US. We've also had a government come in the United Kingdom, which is more pro-EU, but it's still navigating Brexit. What are the signs of the British government trying to, ride out the difficulties that Brexit has imposed? What are the sort of things that it's trying to be flexible on? Because look, there hasn't been as much movement towards the EU as a Remainer like myself would like. What are some of the massive trade issues between the EU and the United Kingdom that still exist now, and what are some of the things that can be done to try and alleviate them, if they even exist, beyond trying to enter into an even more subservient relationship with the EU with regards to accepting their economic policies without having a veto on them like we had as a member state?
Yeah, so really the relationship between the UK and EU is pretty good from a trade perspective, except that it's outside Europe. So it's as good as it can sort of reasonably be expected to be while outside the European Union single market and customs union. The biggest issue at the moment is basically that for the last 40 years, the UK-EU trade relationship grew up around the idea of not having to do any paperwork at the border. And now, inevitably, because the UK is outside the single market, crossing the EU border requires doing a lot of paperwork. So by far the biggest outstanding issues are basically saying, okay, the EU has its standards, the UK has its standards. How can we streamline a UK lorry full of stuff entering the EU without having to individually retest half the things in the truck, without 22 different sort of forms and formulations? Basically, how can you get how can we get the EU to how can the UK get the EU to say, well, if it's made in the United Kingdom, it's probably fine. Or if it's circulating inside the United Kingdom, it's probably fine. That is a really long, boring technical process that requires a lot of goodwill on both sides, where you basically take a bunch of rules and you go, well, you guys ban mad cow disease and we ban mad cow disease. And we've seen how you go about checking whether you have mad cow disease, and it seems to work. So for now, we can just trust that your shipments don't have mad cow disease. You don't need to stop and have your cow individually vet checked the way you currently do. So that's like a long ongoing process. It'll never get you to where the single market and customs union were, where there was literally no border. It's just about like making things a little bit easier for some very specific businesses trading across those borders. That's currently where they're at. The one positive thing you can say about Starmer, and to an extent Sunak as well, is that they have stopped looking for opportunities to pick fights over this stuff. There's no longer this sense that being able to like put your middle fingers up to Brussels is like the whole point of the policy.
Yeah, I very much agree that seemed to be conservative policy. So we do have a question from OLN who said, why did Switzerland in particular get hit so hard by the Trump tariffs, and how will it affect Switzerland?
Yeah, so the why is quite interesting, and really like the short answer is they got incredibly unlucky. So the best guess, I mean, this is all Trump's like misfiring brain. So it's possible we're constructing logic and he just actually just like hates Toblerones. But the logical explanation is, firstly, the Swiss trade surplus with the US has gone up quite a bit in the last 6 months for a really stupid reason. Gold is stored in different weights in Europe and the US. If you want to move gold bricks, gold bars from the US, from Europe to the US, or from anywhere to the US, you have to recut them into a new size. That requires ultra precise because obviously it's gold, so you can't just be like hacking at it with a saw in the backyard. You need to be like micron accurate. The workshop, the factory, whatever it is, that does like 80% of this worldwide happens to be outside, I think, Lugano in Switzerland. Might be outside Lucerne, I can't remember. When all of the Trump chaos started, people started freaking out and moving gold around as stores of value. And the way that works is basically they were importing gold into Switzerland, getting it cut, and then exporting it to the US. So suddenly the Swiss surplus with the US jumps massively, but it's not even Swiss gold. For the most part, in a lot of cases, it was American gold. Americans were moving their gold from like a storehouse somewhere in like Belgium to Switzerland, getting it recut and shipping it to Europe, shipping it to the US, sorry. And that blew up the trade. So that was one thing. The second thing is that at the start of last year, 2024, Switzerland got rid of all of its industrial tariffs. Basically reduced its tariffs on just about everything except agriculture to zero. That meant that when Trump turned up and did his extortion thing and was like, you've got to lower tariffs, we've got this trade deficit with you, you're so unfair. Switzerland was like, the only thing we've got left is agricultural tariffs. And like, we can't cut those because the farmers will literally murder us. They're armed to the teeth, they're very angry, and they all live in swing districts. Like the Swiss farmers do not take their protectionism very, very seriously. It's not entirely clear they're remotely competitive without the tariffs, by the way, without tariffs and subsidies. They're subsidized to the hilt, they've got tariffs, it's a whole thing. But they're preserving the Swiss way of life, and the Swiss way of life is beautiful and lovely. So that's the policy. So they had nothing to give. And when you put those two things together with the fact that like Switzerland's not that important and can't really threaten the US with anything, that kind of all contributed to it being an on goal. What also might have played a role here, though it's never clear how, is Switzerland's a massive pharmaceuticals hub. And Trump's got a bee in his bonnet about pharmaceutical prices in the US. So that might have also been part of the story. So that is what caused it. In terms of like what it means for Switzerland, as people in your comments are saying, like the political classes are very much freaking the fudge out. I'm a little bit more sanguine about the future of Switzerland than some of the political commentary coming out of this country. A lot of what Switzerland makes, there's really no substitute for. Like a lot of Swiss industry is like that gold factory, where it's like something that requires like 15 PhDs and like $1 bazillion in capital, and like there's 2 of these factories in the world, and like they have 55% market share, and it's like, where I always describe it, it's like it's some lens that goes into industrial lasers. And like that's not very exciting, but you need it, and there's nowhere else to get it. So I don't think the tariffs are as scary. The tariffs on gold have already been rescinded because he figured out how someone explained to him how dumb that was. It's obvious it's going to be bad, and Switzerland was already pretty worried about its budget deficit and going through some stuff. So it's not ideal, obviously, and they would love to see it fixed. I don't think it's time to crack each other's heads open and feast on the goo within Kent. But it's not great, but I don't think it's quite as bad as some of the freak out would suggest it is.
Well, also, as you were talking about those farmers mobilizing, I was reminded of that Vinilitary, I can't even pronounce her name, the tweet that she has of the monsters lining up, and it says European farmers mobilizing for the worst cause you've ever heard in your life. It's like,
yeah,
like every time something bad is happening, farmers are out there protesting in favor of that terrible thing.
Absolutely. This is given kind of who you are and what you do, like this is probably quite relevant. But like, I am deeply skeptical that Ukraine will ever be allowed into the European Union, because the European Union has struggled to overcome the objections of farmers in Poland, etc., while Ukraine is at war, while its farms are full of landmines, while investment is basically zero, and while you literally can't even fly into the country. And it's like during that period, they are still giving in to farmer demands, who are saying like, oh, how much wheat Ukraine is shipping is unfair. There, like the idea that once Ukraine wins and Ukrainian agriculture gets the modernization and the investment it needs, and all of that black soil is pumping out wheat in like bazillion commodities. The fact that the idea that like Europeans will be more comfortable letting that compete on the European market, like I'm like, if you're not willing to fight Poland now when Ukrainians are literally dying to keep Russians off the Polish border, how are you going to fight them 6 years from now when there is some sort of peace and Ukraine is stronger than ever? Like it's as Olan says, it's not fun. Like most of trade policy is driven by farmers, like everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much a fuck the farmers kind of guy, so I think that's going to be a running theme on this
What
show.
you do in your free time, Oz?
So listen, thanks so much for giving us your time. I've got one more question for you before I ask people to check out where they can find your work. What are some opportunities? You're a trade expert, so if someone's watching this, they want to try and make some money from some keen investments. The situation's economically tumultuous at the moment, but there are opportunities to be made if you know where those opportunities are to be found. So, can you give us some tips at the moment that would be a good bet over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, listen. Let me say, if you are 19 and trying to choose your career, I'd strongly advise considering becoming a customs broker, because those guys are making absolute bank. As Jupiter Hat says, like defense, obviously doing really really well. I'm not an investment advisor, and so I struggle with all this. What I tend to tell, like when I give speeches at like I'm doing like HSBC, UBS, what I tell those guys who are like big investors who are dealing with companies is like, one thing that is going to change is that with trade becoming a lot more turbulent, the companies that are going to do well are the ones that have a really good information pipeline between like Jimmy on the ground at the port of Delaware or whatever, at the port, not Delaware, at the port of Baltimore, who is suddenly encountering a weird rule, and like your COO, making sure that like Barry on the ground doesn't feel like he can't raise that issue, can't warn people about it because he's just expected to like fix it. The companies that are going to fuck up are the ones who don't know how to talk to themselves and don't know how to like identify problems early and deal with them, and that have a culture of like shouting down or frightening people and telling them that they should just sort things out. So, I mean, I don't think this is particularly useful advice, but just like, as always, just find companies with good company culture, and they will probably navigate whatever is coming a lot better than rigid bureaucracies that are super hierarchical, because the more chaotic things get, the worse those kind of companies can deal with it. And the world is changing really, really fast.
What about commodities or forex? Is there anything at the moment that we should be keeping our eye on? That, obviously oil, gold, but are there any fluctuations coming that we should be aware of because of the trade policies from the United States? You've already touched upon gold, so yeah, maybe there's anything else we should keep an eye on.
So one thing that's really clear and is really important to understand is how little trade policy tends to move markets. Even the post-Liberation Day crash was not because traders were like that scared of tariffs. It's because the economy briefly realized that Trump was so insane as to do shit like this. it was a judgment on the Trump administration. And the reason it all like went away when he like immediately backed down is that markets took a deep breath out and went, okay, he's crazy, but he's not like completely insane. We're fine. We can keep doing business. So one thing to sort of just blanket note is that this tariff stuff will move markets less than you think it will. What I would watch like hawks in terms of like commodities and stuff is bond rates and government borrowing rates. They're going up everywhere. It's really bad. A lot of countries are also at like really low. Not the U.S., but a lot of other countries are already at really low interest rates and don't have a lot of space to cut further. They've stimulated as much as they can, so they don't have a lot left in the tank if there is any kind of a recession. And nobody's got negative bond rates right now. So what I would be looking for is sort of long-term stable assets, because there's a lot of potential uncertainty coming down the pipe, and governments are going to have even fewer tools to deal with it than they did in 2008 and during COVID.
So look, while I've got you here, I've got one more question that I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
seeing as we're talking about this kind of thing. The markets obviously shat the bed when Liz Truss tried to cut services for a massive tax cut for the rich. And, you know, Trussites, far from going away, have continued to say the same thing that they were saying under Truss. And some of the situations that the Starmer government has had to deal with are coming up against these tight fiscal rules, coming up against the way the bond markets are, etc., for borrowing, and realizing they don't have the headroom to be able to do the kinds of sweeping investments in public infrastructure that a Labour government absolutely wants to do, whether people are skeptical that Starmer wants to do that or not. It's a lot more complicated than that. So can you talk to us about why the markets reacted to Truss the way they did, and what Starmer is trying to navigate with the tight fiscal situation that the UK is currently dealing with, partly as a result of some of the economic decisions made about the UK over the 14 years of the last government?
Yeah, so I think first of all, like, markets reacted to Truss the way they did because libertarian economics is fun to talk about, but you should never actually try it. And they could see her trying it. Basically, the scale of what she was proposing was a massive amount of tax cuts for the top end of town, combined with services cuts to the bottom end of town. So if you think about what that does to the economy, it increases the amount of money the government collects in the first instance through that tax cut. And then, yes, it cuts spending, but when you cut services that hard, what you're basically doing is like draining a lot of economic activity out of the economy, because like quite literally you're like firing nurses and you're performing fewer surgeries. So in a way, the economy gets hit from like two sides. And what they saw that doing was basically there was increased panic that if this went through, the odds of the UK being able to continue servicing its debt without just printing massive amounts of money were decreasing. And you saw bond rates go up. So the cost of government borrowing go up so high that everybody freaked out and threw her out. The reason the Starmer administration finds itself in a difficult place, setting aside, his personal failures and failures of his government, it seems to be convinced that the way that they are going to win the next election is by winning over reform voters, by being more Farage than Farage, which is interesting as a political strategy. Setting aside its morality is just like a curious attempt at politics, and we'll see how that works out for them. But setting that aside, just on the pure economic side, they are up to the point where if they want to spend more money, they have to do one of two things. They are spending the tax revenue, or they have, and in fact they are in deficit. So they can borrow more money, but bond rates are already high and climbing, which means that every £1 million £1 that they borrow costs them more and more and more each time. Or they can raise taxes. and for some reason they really don't want to raise tax. So they have no good option for how to get money, because the two ways a government can ever get money is by raising it from within the country or by borrowing it on markets. You could also, I guess, print it, but that also has downsides.
Well, listen, thank you. It's been absolutely enlightening. So if people want to learn more about your work, can they go and visit you have a Substack, you have your website, and I'll put a link to be able to find your books. But yeah, where can people find your work?
So I have a website called explaintrade.com. I don't keep a regular blog, but anytime I find I have something to say, I go and say it there. Otherwise, yeah, I read a book called Why Politicians Lie About Trade, which is basically just this for 230 pages. I kind of describe it like me cornering you at a bar and trying to maintain a healthy balance of explaining trade to you, but not making you hit me with a chair. That's the vibe I'm going for. I'm not sure if I always nail it. So yeah, there's the book, and then I'm on Blue Sky since Twitter went crazy.
Yeah, well, listen, you're far too modest. You've given us a really fascinating discussion tonight. You've really answered a lot of the questions that I had about some of these topics. I hope you've answered the audience's questions that they may have had. They've certainly thrown a lot at you tonight. So thank you for giving us all of your time. Really, really appreciate it. So thanks a lot, Dmitry, and I'll speak to you soon. All the best.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for everything you do.
Oh, my pleasure. Bye-bye. So that was Dmitry Grozoubinski. And yeah, I think we learned a lot there. I know trade isn't and economics isn't really the more exciting kinds of topics, but again, we're trying to learn new things, trying to expand the horizons of myself, but also hopefully try and teach my audience some things as well. Well, again, I'm not the one teaching you. I'm bringing on people far more educated than myself to make those kinds of remarks. So that was the end of another week's worth of shows. I hope you enjoyed it. Dmitry there in the chat. Thank you, Dmitry, so much. I enjoyed it, especially. I'm sure the audience did too. Yeah, never been interested in international trade economics, but I've been gripped. Yeah, well, thank you, Dave from next door. Thank you, Random Shot in the Dark, Factabulous, Naked Amber, Jimmy the Hat, OLN, Spazalot, all of you guys in the chat tonight. Siger, yeah, I think that's everyone. Mick D Gunner as well. I think that's all of you. Thank you for your contributions tonight. Really appreciate everyone that's always tapping away in the chats. It isn't the same without you. It's the audience engagement that makes this a stream, not a podcast. Obviously, I have a podcast called This Is Not a Drill. Please do check it out. We have a very big guest coming for you on that next week, so look out for that. But yeah, look, a really, really fascinating week's worth of discussions. Got some interesting shows for you lined up. Now, I might, in fact, stream tomorrow night, depending on how I feel, because this Trump-Putin summit is going to happen. It's going to happen late here in Kyiv. But I figure I might do a reaction episode to that. I don't quote me on that, but I might go live tomorrow to talk about that. We'll see if I can get a last minute guest to come on as well. So again, listen, if you're watching along on Twitter, I know more than 1,000 of you are currently watching along on Twitter. So yeah, if you're watching along there, please do consider coming over to Twitch, getting an account, and following and writing a message in the chat next time. We really do appreciate more of you coming on and trying to grow the community out. So if you want to engage with the show, that's the only way to do it, through Twitch. If you're following on YouTube, I've tried to find ways to make it more interactive for you guys. But if there's any ideas you have, any thoughts, please do stick them in the comment section. Please do like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. The bigger we grow, the more guests, the cooler guests we can have, and the more we can try and do something interesting. I am going to try and offer up something very unique next week, hopefully on this show, as well as on the podcast. So yeah, there might be a special surprise. Watch this space for an announcement next week. And yeah, we'll see how it goes, and maybe stream tomorrow. I'm not sure. We will see. As I said before, if you've been watching along any shows this week, I'm not expecting there to be, peace in our time kind of an announcement. But we will see. We will see. Does X have a live chat? It does, but it doesn't connect to this easily. And it's just easier to keep everyone on Twitch. And also, I'm trying to grow. I'm not, I think that Twitter has really degenerated as a platform over the last few years for obvious reasons. So I'm trying to encourage people to follow me on a different platform, because this platform is more valuable than my Twitter platform is at the moment. It's just a case of used to be able to share your work on Twitter as a journalist and it would go very far, and now it doesn't do anywhere near as much because links are throttled and stuff. So it's only really pictures that go viral nowadays. And it's unless I'm going out and on those days that I do go out and take photos myself, those still go viral. But the general day-to-day interactions with Twitter are, I suppose I'm also putting less into it. But either way, the point explaining is that I'm trying to grow my audience on these other platforms. And it would be nice to have a larger audience on Twitch that I can talk to in a very different manner. I think that Twitter and platforms like it kind of generate a lot more hostility. And it's a lot harder to be hostile in this environment where I'm having to talk to you directly. So I feel a lot more relaxed in these kinds of formats than I do generally in that kind of microblogging environment. Anyway, so maybe tomorrow we'll come on and we'll do a show that's maybe just me reacting. But yeah, listen, thanks everyone for following along. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you all. As always, please do like and subscribe and follow along if you're not doing so. I'm going to ask you every episode, so you won't shut me up if you already have done it. And if you have done it, I apologize for me saying it over and over again. But if you haven't, please do. Really appreciate it. Anyway, listen, thanks a lot. This has been another wonderful week of shows. I've been Katerji. This has been the Katerji Show, and I will see you on the next one. Good night.